on AFR Talk.
Welcome back. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. And what did Secretary Kerry's been making the case, I understand. Let's find out what he has to say when it comes to boots on the ground and what we're going to be doing in this military action. Roll it.
Mr. Chairman, it would be preferable not because there's any intention or any plan or any desire whatsoever to have boots on the ground. I think the President will give you every assurance in the world, as am I, as the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman. But in the event Syria imploded, for instance, or in the event there was a threat of a chemical weapons cache falling into the hands of al-Nusra or someone else, and it was clearly in the interests of our allies and all of us, the British, the French, and others, to prevent those weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of the worst elements. I don't want to take off the table an option that might or might not be available to a President of the United States to secure our country. The bottom line is the President has no intention and will not, and we do not want to, put American troops on the ground to fight this or be involved in the fighting of this civil war.
Welcome, Bruce Thornton, Professor Bruce Thornton. He, of course, is the author of The Wages of Appeasement and a senior research fellow at the Hoover, a national fellow at the Hoover Institution, as well as a professor of classics and humanities at Fresno State University. Bruce, Professor, welcome back. How are you?
Thanks. Thank you, Crane.
Tell me, when you've seen the case that's been presented by the administration, you just heard a little part of this. I mean, it's, no, we're not going to have troops on the ground. We'll do this, we'll do that. We can go, but we want to get the resolution through Congress. Your thoughts overall, drinking it all in on the president's case to attack Assad's weapons caches?
Well, first, the argument about we have to act to uphold some imaginary international norms, et cetera, is ridiculous. There's no such thing as international norms. There are treaties that nations sign, and they sign them because they think their interests are served. By the way, Syria did not sign the Chemical Weapons Convention. So that raises the interesting question, well, then on what grounds are we punishing Syria? Is there some higher morality? And if so, where does it come from? The whole international norms delusion has been damaging our foreign policy since the Cold War, and we need to get back to the constitutional, common sense reality of this country's use of military force, and that's to defend and protect our interests and security. So that brings us to point two. What is our specific interest and security interests in Syria? That case needs to be made, and I haven't heard it made yet. I've just heard vague statements that, well, if we don't do this, we're not, other nations will be emboldened to use chemical weapons. Well, remember in the 80s, Saddam Hussein killed 3,000 to 5,000 of his own people, and who knows how many Iranians with chemical weapons? That never was punished, and when he was punished by the United States, of course, that didn't seem to act as a deterrent factor. So I don't buy that psychology for 5 seconds. And then finally, if you do determine that it is in our interest and security, then you do not say we're only going to do X, or we're not going to put boots on the ground, or we're only going to be there for 3 months, or we're only going to target this or that. You don't put those limitations on it. If it's in our interest to get rid of this guy, then get rid of him and do whatever it takes to get rid of him. So this whole rationale is incoherent and duplicitous, and I think the reason is it's all about Obama's political credibility, because he shot his mouth off as he is wont to do and started talking about red lines and changing his calculus, and now his bluff's been called.
You have pointed out a number of things you just said in your article regarding the case that's being made, and it is interesting because in reading your piece, as well as understanding your command of history, which you outline in The Wages of Appeasement, this delusion of the international community and international norms and, hey, we can all come together and prevent, well, things like this ever happening again, inevitably we are left with the reality that no, other countries won't. They don't share our values, and at some point it will impact our national security interest. Tell me, number one, do you agree with that when it comes to Syria? Because I contend it will, and there's a part of it that does, certainly. But do you agree with that? And if so, what is the threshold for you to take action against the Assad government and, in essence, go with regime change?
Right. Well, 2.5 years ago, I think the case could have been made more convincingly. It is Obama's peculiar genius to make things worse, and he's got us now to a point where if Assad stays, it's bad for us. If Assad goes, it's bad for us. If Assad stays, you empower Hezbollah, you empower Iran, you make Iran, Russia really the dominant power in the Middle East instead of the United States. And you anger and compromise our allies in Jordan, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, who are furious with us, by the way, over this whole mess. However, let's say the Assad regime collapses. We do not have any idea who this insurgency is. We know that there are Al-Qaeda-related jihadist outfits fighting. There may be others who are not jihadists in the Al-Qaeda mold, but are they liberal Democrats who are going to coexist peacefully with Israel and create separation of church and state and not Sharia law? I seriously doubt it. So we're looking at Islamists who are extremely violent and other Islamists who are less violent and maybe a little bit more tactically savvy to know that they can get a lot from us without blowing us up. At any rate, no one has convincingly come out and said we have knowledge of who is who and we have a way of sorting them out, which means that if Assad collapses, you could see a jungle state arise, like Afghanistan in the 70s, with space created for jihadist outfits to create training camps, et cetera, as they did in Afghanistan during the war with Russia. So there, it's a tough call. And I would hate to be the one who would have to make it. But as I said already, if we are going to decide that it's in our better interest, then we have to accept the whole package of what we're going to do, which means we're going to have to accept another Iraq. Okay, we're not going to go in and get out. We're going to go in. We're going to kill a bunch of people. We're going to have to stay. We're going to have to try to build institutions. That is, we're going to do Iraq all over again. So politically, and by that I mean for the American people, I don't see that happening.
Iraq and how it's been characterized in history, my take, and may disagree, obviously you're right to do so. My take is the Democrats saw an opportunity to politicize our national security, and that's what they did. They sacrificed our national security on the altar of politics, going with Bush lied, people died, and they've continued to do that. Now they're running against their own narrative. Interestingly enough, we go to Syria, and we have what we were going to use against the Assad regime for allowing the attacks and suicide bombers and a whole host of things to happen during the war. But during the war, we said, you know what? We're going to keep those Islamists in your country, and then you're going to have to deal with them. And now, ironically, that's what he's contending with, among other things. And we're dealing with a situation where we also had an opportunity here to get rid of Assad through the UN resolution of all things, but a penalty for killing Hariri. And so you have these opportunities time and time again to do the right thing and follow through. We didn't do it. So doesn't that teach us that at some point we better start following through?
Absolutely. I mean, go back to Iraq. And for all the mistakes in the center, it was working until Obama came in and he did not get the status of forces agreement, which he could have got. He could have sat him down and said, you know what, they're going to be here. You're going to have 30,000 U.S. troops here in an air base, and, you all just deal with it. But he wanted to get out because he campaigned that he was going to end that war and he was going to bring all the boys home. So now Iraq, descending back into the kind of sectarian violence that was there before, and drawing ever closer to Iran, and it is going to be a satellite of Iran. So you're right. We have to, when we make the decision, as somebody said, if you go to take Vienna, take Vienna. If you're going to attack militarily because you have an aim that you need to achieve, you have to have every option on the table. You cannot tailor some politically comfortable, response like shooting off $150 million worth of cruise missiles, particularly after you've telegraphed to them that you're coming, so they've moved anything of value, kill some, civilians, which becomes a public relations issue. That's not going to cut it. In that case, you're better off not going in. So if we think that that's a imperative of our security and interest to do that, then we got to go all out. But then that raises the question, politically, the American people going to get behind that? Are they going to support it? I don't think so.
Yeah, not to jump in there and interrupt, but not after Afghanistan, what we've seen with Iraq and what happened in Benghazi and the murder, not even holding people to account for killing 4 Americans, including our ambassador. That came up today as well, among other things. Now, Professor, what I want to ask you is, if you're sitting there on my cabinet, and I'm President Obama, okay, 2 really wild things that just happened there, but if you're sitting there or an advisor to me, I say, historically, what happens when we look at the war as a war on Islamofascism and we don't break it and segregate it out? We recognize it's part of a greater war. Afghanistan and Iraq were part of a greater war. What happens when we don't do something at this point? If we could, what's an example of what could happen historically as things line up? What are we looking at, Professor?
Well, you have several different dimensions. You have to know your enemy correctly. We have not done that under both parties. We continue to believe that there's a minority of Islamists or jihadists who are somehow hijacked and distorted their faith in order to pursue their totalitarian aims. And there's a big majority of peaceful Muslims who just want to get along, et cetera. And the reality is obviously much, much more complex than that. And so going in, we were hobbled by that failure to understand the nature of Islam. So we thought doing certain things that would be effective with a fellow Westerner, with a Frenchman or a German or something, maybe. Yeah, didn't cut any ice. It's like, well, wait a minute, we're building these schools. And they say, oh, school for girls? We don't want girls to go to school. That's a violation of Islam. You're not any of Islam. That's just one example of things. The main thing, I think, I would say, is we have to understand a mentality that respects force and despises weakness. And offering to negotiate, offering to make concessions, showing restraint, etc., which we think of as virtues, and they are in our civilization. And in dealing with people like us most of the time, that's fine. But it doesn't work there. It creates contempt and weakness, and the perception of weakness, which invites more aggression. And that's the main, I think that's the main problem that we've had in all of these various conflicts we're in.
Professor, I'm asking this as the audience knows, at times we go overtime with guests, and I don't know what your time is because I know you've got commitments through teaching and everything else, but would you be able to stick with us after break and answer one question in regard to where we were in 2004 and that error that we made by not pressing forward? That would be great. Okay, so what we're going to do is unpack a little history, recent history, and apply it to where we are now, and hopefully that will give us some guidance. Also, we'll keep returning to the idea of what is the threshold for us to get involved, and can President Obama do it? Is there any evidence that the Commander-in-Chief can actually unite our country and explain to us what we are fighting? Professor Bruce Thornton, the author of The Wages of Appeasement, Hoover Institution Senior Fellow, sticks with us right here. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on. Say it with me now. AFR Talk.